We have some new information, and we have some old information that we're going to cover in this budget workshop number 5. The agenda has some additional items on here that we haven't covered in the past at the previous 4 budget workshops. Property values and student enrollment. So property values for, well, I should say the estimated property values for 2019. We haven't shown this by the major property categories, but the amounts we received, or the value we received back in April, shows us with a 6.23% increase. Certified estimate over the previous month, actually that represents about a 6.21% increase over August of 2018 certified value. Now, at the time, we knew that there was discussion regarding property caps or revenue caps, so we weren't as excited when we saw this number because, again, the specter of having a cap applied to 1920 was still there, although with some information we received today, which everybody received today with the press conference for House Bill 3, it's going to change that number, or how we feel about that number for 1920. But as you'll hear us say over the next few weeks, possibly the next month, we'll know when we know. I think the governor mentioned today that the bill is 300 pages long. Have fun reading it, I think was his comment. So we are going to go through it, but we have some very good people that we work with to try to figure out what this means exactly for HISD for 1920, and then as best as we can to prognosticate what it means for 2021, or really the biennium. Again, just showing you the taxable value history for HISD going back to 2005. It's been on an upward trajectory just about since that time. The 2019 value of 186 is represented there. The next graph shows you the percentage change from the previous year. It's not showing a decrease in property values, but just a decrease in the percentage change from the previous year in relation to what's happening with property values over the last plus 10 years. The Property Tax Assistance Division lag. This appears to be a moot point because based on what we heard today, the lag, which means that normally we would be using prior year property values for state purposes. If you're a Chapter 42 district, for instance, it would determine how much the state is going to send you. It's the state's recognition of your property wealth, and they would always use the prior year property value. But we have heard today that in House Bill 3, we are moving to current year values. We don't know exactly how that's going to work. So this was just our way of covering what the lag meant for us. And again, just very briefly, what the lag was able to do for us is that if the state was recognizing HISD's property value for 2018, it was 6.21% lower than it is for 2019, at least the estimated amount. So the state viewed us as being not as property wealthy as we think we're going to be based on the certified estimate that we received. With that apparently being thrown out now and us using current year values, we're going to have to work through that because we've not used current year values before. We've always used prior year. That's why we refer to it as a lag, because there's a lag of a year between what the state recognizes your property value at and what we are able to actually tax on in that current tax year. This is showing really the inverse relationship between the property taxes that we are collecting and the state aid we're receiving. At a point in 2016-17, we went negative, meaning that the amount of money that we were receiving from the state was actually less than what we were sending back. So when people ask that question, does HISD receive state assistance? The answer is yes, but when you compare it to what we actually send back, it's a negative situation. So by saying no, we are technically correct by answering that we do not receive any state aid. Enrollment in WADA, this is again something that we've talked a lot about because WADA is the driver that determines, at least for now, what our recapture payments have been since 16-17. The higher the WADA, weighted ADA, the lower our recapture payment is going to be. So if you can take a look at enrollment, there's a slight decline there in 18-19 and 19-20, but that's again going back to the assumptions that we made for 19-20 in relation to what some of the trends that we've seen, especially this year for 18-19, and always being very conservative and not trying to assume that we're going to have a higher WADA than necessary, because we would certainly build that into the budget for our recapture payment. But if those numbers don't materialize, then we are amending the budget to recognize a higher recapture payment. So for our purposes, we rather estimate a higher recapture payment at the original adopted budget than have to make the adjustment in February to have to tell the board that our recapture payment is going to go up by another $30 or $40 million. We want to avoid that. But on that topic, it does appear that recapture for HISD in 2019-20 is going to be different under House Bill 3. I'm not going to say it's going to be zero, because I haven't read the 300-page bill, but it appears to be less than what our predictions were based on current law. But we certainly will get that information and try to incorporate it into another budget presentation, or perhaps even at the budget hearing as more information becomes available regarding what House Bill 3 means. So again, going back to our assumptions, I think really budget workshops number 1 through 4 started with this. We called them building blocks, assumptions. This is where we are. These are really the big items that we start every budget with. Usually in the fall, we look at what's our comptroller value going to be? What are our values going to be? We know that at least our tax rates for next year, from our limited understanding of House Bill 3, they should not change very much. The tax compression doesn't appear to come into play until the second year of the biennium, or 2020-21. So we're looking at a $1.04 M&O rate for next year. There's no anticipated change in the INS rate. All the calculations that are in this particular budget and all the budget presentations we've had before are based on current law, because that's all we had was current law. Enrollment, we're still predicting the 1,500 decrease for 19-20, which then translates into also a reduction in WADA, which it did increase our estimate of our recapture payment for next year. Assuming we have a recapture payment for next year, but we don't know. This is a comparison between 18-19's original adopted budget and 19-20's current projected, and Mr. Reed will go through this.
So talk about revenues a little bit first. Obviously, the increase in local sources, that's our property taxes from the 2% growth that we had budgeted. State sources has a pretty good increase. That is, at the previous board meetings, we talked about Tier 2 funding, the dollars we received on the golden pennies. We projected that to go up by about $30 million. So that is why that number has increased. Federal sources was from the BABs, the Build America bond subsidies that we were recognizing in the general fund. Our change in the recapture payment right now is $22 million. Again, assuming that it doesn't assume anything with the recent changes. And then the 2018-19 step schedule salary increases, that happened after the original budget last year. So we've got to bring it into the budget this year. So it's a $5 million increase to this year's budget. TRS, that's a pass-through amount. It's just a book entry, basically, of the state's payment on TRS on behalf, and we book a revenue and appropriation in the same amount. The capital lease recognition is the same thing. That is basically the power recognition of the power-up laptop assets. So we record a revenue and an appropriation in the exact same amount. State compensatory education, $10 million. That is due to us going to a CEP district, which means we get funding on pretty much almost all of our students for state compensatory education. Now that is changing. It'll no longer be based on the meals and so forth. So that number will probably change. The wraparound specialists, after mid-year adjustment, so that again was also added in using the state comp ed numbers. So since it was done after original budget, it has to be brought into the budget this year. Same thing with Achieve 180. We use state comp ed dollars to fund that, the $4.3 million. So that was after original budget, so it has to be brought in for this year. TERS, or our tax increment reinvestment zones, whenever that goes up, it's a reduction in what we report to the state as far as our tax collection, so we get a credit back in our state funding formula, so we get those dollars back. Connections Academy, last fall, their state comp ed plan was approved by the state. So that means that they are actually now eligible for their economically disadvantaged students or their free reduced lunch students for state comp ed funding. So we have to bring that into the budget. And then career and technology, we are increasing our full-time equivalents or the FTEs that we get for CTE. So we added dollars to that department this year. They then put out into the campuses. Health insurance, we've built in a $7.5 million health insurance district contribution. We also added $10 million last year and $10 million the year before that. We'll talk a little bit more about health insurance later. Charter school enrollment increase. This year they were showing some enrollment increases. So that is additional dollars we've got to put into the charter schools whenever that happens. Property liability auto insurance, this is kind of our early estimate. We still do not know what that number is going to be, but we've got about $2 million built in for property insurance. Claims still haven't been finalized with the insurance company. We expect that may go up more later in the year by the time we get to April next year. HCAD is building in a 3% increase to their budget this year, so we do have some increase in HCAD costs or appraisal district costs. And then transfers out for debt. That's actually a decrease this year. There was about $10 million that was savings from the North Forest projects, and we don't need to transfer that out this year. But that is actually just offset by the amount that we have set aside in our assigned fund balance. So it's really a net neutral change. Facility custodial services, operations actually cut about $15 million last year. They actually ran out of funds this March. They had about $1 million left. And so we had to supplement that budget this year. So we decided to go ahead and put that money back into facilities. Special ed teams, it's 5 teams to go out and support special education. Fine arts campuses, this is 23 campuses, fine arts positions. And then we have some smaller increases for AED machine replacements throughout the district. Some bond transportation for those schools being rebuilt. And then some positions in HR for investigation and some source specialist for procurement.
Okay.
Campus PUA enrollment decline from 18-19. This is not a budget cut for 19-20 to their PUA. This is the dollars that were taken back because of a loss of students in 18-19. So since we have 4,000 fewer kids, then that's basically the reduction in what happened during this year. District-wide operating was reduced just to help fund some of the increases within the district. Candy Stripe, that contract was not renewed this year, so those dollars then are no longer needed in the budget. So that's a reduction of the budget. Then the performance review that was funded last year for the Legislative Budget Board, that was a one-time cost in the budget, so we have reduced that budget going into next year. So all in, appropriations are $2.1 billion, 2145 versus the 2043. It shows a budget deficit of $44 million. However, I mentioned earlier the North Forest projects. We have funds set aside in an assigned fund balance for those projects. So that money, there's $8.4 million that will actually be taken out of fund balance for that purpose. So the actual budget deficit from operations is $35.5 or $36 million. Y'all have seen this as well. This is the recapture projections. Next year, projecting about $295 million. And then, of course, it continues to go up. That's projecting 2% flat enrollment and basically the same WADA.
The other topic that we have covered, it's been several months, but we have made note of it in every budget workshop since that time, is the health insurance cost. This is something that is, again, always a topic for school districts, really for everybody here in the state, if not the country, regarding the increasing cost of health insurance. Initially, back in the fall, we were looking at not having to put any additional money into the health insurance fund directly from the general fund, but based on trends that we've been seeing with the usage of our own plan, we had to build in that $7.5 million increase from the district that Mr. Reed just talked about. In addition, we thought that this was the year for us to have to start to increase rates for employees, given the fact that we are, at least right now, seeing over the next several years increases to employee premium rates anywhere between 3 to 5%. Now, of course, we're going to try to mitigate those as much as possible, but we're not at the point now that we can mitigate or keep employees insulated from what are rising health insurance costs. For us to be able to do that, that means that the money's going to have to come from somewhere, and that would have to come from the district. And the district is already contributing a higher percentage than compared to just a few years ago. The 5% increase, in fact, we initially started with a 6% increase in expected premium rates. We pulled that back to 5%. That will start in January of 2020 with our medical plan year, which runs on a calendar year basis. These are the trends that we have seen going back to 2013-14. The gray line at the bottom shows where we are with fund balance in the health insurance fund. $20 million is about the lowest we'd like to get that particular fund balance level. And as you can see, the red line expenditures are going up in relation to revenues, and we're going to have to remedy that with, again, an additional contribution from the district, as well as asking employees to pick up the remaining amount that's needed for a health insurance plan. This is the same information that the board has seen before, but I believe the first time we showed this, it had a 6% increase versus the 5% that we're proposing now. At the bottom right, on the box to the right, you see the select plan. There is no planned increase for the employees on the select plan. However, for every other option, you do see what the annual increase would be for employees if we increase the premiums by 5%. This is what I alluded to. So the HISD contribution is now projected to be 77% in 1920, up from 70% just a few years ago. So the cost of our health insurance plan is really being carried by HISD versus the employees, and we tried to do that in a way that, again, we have not passed on these cost increases necessarily to the employees, but there comes a time when we have to make a decision that employees are going to have to start to pay a bit more for their health insurance, just like the district has been increasing its contribution over the last several years. The other area that we have talked about before in regard to salary increases, we started back in December saying that we would start to build the budget for 1920 with no salary increases of any kind built into the budget. We knew that we were entering a legislative year, and in January we heard that the two big items, actually the one big item was school finance reform, closely followed by property tax relief, and we did not know exactly what that meant at that time. To be quite honest, even up until a few hours ago, we still didn't know what that meant because there had not been a decision reached on House Bill 3. But nonetheless, we have gone through some salary cost scenarios running increases at 3%, 4%, and 5% for all employees in two different ways. One is a salary increase of 3%, 4%, and 5% with an experience differential, which is also called a step, and one without. So we'll kind of go through those very quickly. But before we do, I think this was important, which we haven't talked about before, to talk about all the different job groups that are on which is the teacher pay scale. Glenn, you want to go from here?
So when we talk about teacher step, there are other jobs that really follow the teacher step. So we have a other teacher group in the comp manual. It's teacher other schedule, and on that schedule are nurses, librarians, registrars, speech therapists. All these jobs up here follow the teacher scale. Counselors gets the teachers follows the same scale, but they have $1,000 added to their salary, and then evaluation specialists have $3,000 added to their scale. We also have a master schedule. So on the comp manual, you'll see a master schedule by different pay grades. Has a lot of different folks on that step scale, on the master scale. This isn't all the job codes. There are a lot of different job titles out there, but these are the most prominent: custodians and police officers, social workers, warehouse workers, admin assistants, clerks, the wraparound resource specialists, recruiters, accountants, directors, managers. All those folks are on the master pay schedule. We also have hourly job groups. So again, this is not all the job titles. These are the titles where we have the most folks: custodians, police officers, student workers, security guards, tutors, et cetera. So for the hourly job group, so the difference is that other than your food service attendants on this group, everyone else doesn't really have a set schedule. So they may work 5 hours one week, 10 hours next week, 30 hours. Some of them might be full-time, but they don't have a set schedule. On the master schedule, they have a set schedule. They work X number of days a year, X number of hours a day, and they're expected to work those hours. If they don't work those hours, then they have to turn in time, or their pay is docked. So that's really the difference between the master and the hourly schedules. So this first slide shows what a 3, 4, and 5% increase is without basically moving the experience on the schedule where it is now. In other words, not getting that differential. So if step is moving from 6 to 7 and it's $250, then that $250 is not included. This is just saying everyone gets a flat 3, 4, and 5 on their salary that they're currently making. So for example, under 3% to the general fund, a total cost to give all employees a 3% increase is $35 million. 4.3 of it is other funds like nutrition services, grants that we have. So the total of that is $39 million. Teachers on here, general fund, it's a $20 million cost to give just a 3% increase to teachers. So and it flows for the 4 and 5%, $46 million cost of the general fund under 4%, and $58 million cost for 5% under the general fund. This one is same 3 to 5%, except this is also getting the step differential. So you're basically moving a step and then also the receiving a 3% increase on top of that. So with that one, it's about $38 million to the general fund. So it goes from 32 to 38. So it's about a $5.2, $5.4 million increase just by moving the step. And that step would include the APs that are on a step and principal elementaries are on a step. So that includes them moving a step as well. But that's a $41 million cost to the general fund to do step movement and the 3%. $52 million to the general fund for 4%, and $64 million to the general fund to do a 5% increase. On the 3%, that's about $5.4 million to the general fund just for the step portion of the increase. On all three schedules, the step is about $5.4 million.
Oh, you're going to press it for me. Thanks. As you can tell, based on the largeness of these numbers, we couldn't start the budget back in December for 1920 trying to incorporate, in this case, if we had even looked at, let's say, a 3% with the step of over $40 million into the budget. I mean, as I know that there's only been 1 year in recent memory. I think it was 14, 15, 15, 16 without a raise. Is that right?
16, 17.
16, 17. But other years before that, there have been some kind of increases in pay. But there were different times. That was our first year of recapture. So we had to take a look at it from the perspective of, we knew that we were entering into a legislative session that was going to change the funding. So we didn't want to come out of the chute right away by building in a 3, 4, 5% increase in salaries for any of these particular groups, simply because we knew that was not going to be sustainable. And we didn't want to make it appear that we came out in December and January gung-ho about being able to do this, because we didn't know whether or not we were going to have the capability of being able to incorporate any kind of raise in there. And then certainly after the lieutenant governor indicated that there was a push to do a $5,000 raise for teachers, and then became teachers and full-time librarians, I believe, we had to kind of pull back and say, let's wait to see what happens exactly with what the state is going to be able to fund as we move forward. Well, here's where we are today. We have a bill. Still don't know exactly what it means for us. It's going to take several weeks, if not a month and a half, for us to figure out what it really means for HISD, for us to be able to continue operations for next year. The operations we have in place now, still continuing to fund Achieve 180 and all the other things that we do, and to incorporate any kind of raise potentially into the budget. We simply just don't know what the value of those discretionary dollars are going to be next year. So I know that perhaps some board members saw some runs that were done by different groups under House Bill 3, what it meant for us. But to be quite honest, we didn't put a lot of faith in them, because we knew that was just, on a piece of paper, and we had to see the details. That's what we are rooted in. Where are the details? What does this really mean for us? I couldn't go to the superintendent and say, well, if there's something you want to do, we know we have the dollars for it, because we didn't know if there were going to be any dollars for it. So we still have challenges in front of us. So we are still recommending at this point, even a few hours after House Bill 3 apparently is a done deal, that we adopt the budget based on current law. That's what we know right now. There is no cut to the PUA. We talked about that early on, but there is no cut to the PUA that we have currently in the budget, nor do we expect that to be any different for the budget that is amended in September, possibly even August, but I would vote that we probably would look at bringing the budget back to the board probably in September, once we know what House Bill 3 is going to do to us. There are no department cuts. It doesn't mean that there couldn't be some reorganizations within the departments to perhaps make them more efficient. And again, the last bullet is that the changes will be incorporated into the budget once we know what we can do with any additional dollars, if any, that are going to be provided to us by House Bill 3. I know that, based on what was discussed today, that it appears as though, districts like HISD are going to have additional dollars next year. But until we've run the numbers and run the template, which we probably won't have for a couple of weeks now, the template tells all. That's when you can actually get into the details to know exactly what is happening with weights, with tax rates and other things that are happening within our complicated school finance formulas. And again, I just covered these. Why are we making this recommendation? Because we want to bring a budget to the superintendent, who can then bring it to her board, a budget that we know that we can stand behind to say that these dollars here, these revenues, we can stand behind them to say that this is what is going to happen next year with our tax rate, with everything else that's going to be incorporated into House Bill 3. But we also have some other things that are happening. On June 7th, we're going to be posting in the Houston Chronicle the required notice, which tells the community on June 18th there's going to be a budget hearing for the budget and for the proposed tax rate. We won't adopt the tax rate at that time, of course, but we are going to have to do the necessary things that we have to do by law to get the budget in front of the board for adoption on June 18th. The very last bullet there, special legislative session is possible. I wanted to take it off, but I was convinced otherwise that we should probably put that in there. But as of today, it doesn't appear that there's going to be a special session based on what we heard today with House Bill 3. That was a sticking point. They couldn't come to an agreement on what's going to be in House Bill 3, so we were thinking, well, we go into special session. But apparently that appears to be off the table now. But again, we know that based on what we heard today, we will have revenue caps, but not until the second year of the biennium, 2021. So 1920 doesn't appear to be there. And that's one thing. It could be great, but we will have to see all the numbers before we can kind of put it together to present to the superintendent what the budget for next year it looks like, and really for maybe even 2021. That's what we're going to be doing. Between now and June 18th, we have some procedural things that we have to go through. I just saw today the budget, if you will, which actually is the budget format that the board will see and consider for adoption on the 18th. It's by function, has the revenues and functions, and that's when we finally say the budget is prepared and has been done, because it incorporates, after the budget department spent 2 or 3 days compiling, putting the puzzle together with our current budget process, so we can actually see what the budget looks like, which, by the way, does show the $35 million or $36 million deficit. But now we are at that point. And I think because we got to this point after many, many months, we're not going to have enough time to figure out what HB3 means to incorporate that into a budget that we can present to the superintendent for adoption on the 18th. So again, our recommendation is to adopt the budget that has been prepared up to this point, and we will then continue working then on, instead of trying to incorporate that into a budget to be adopted on the 18th, give us some time to actually understand House Bill 3, and we can bring that back to the board with a recommendation to the superintendent at some time later in the year, September probably.